So today we're going to continue our discussion of comparing multiple populations. So last time when we talked about comparing two different populations. So oftentimes what happens in social science is that we want to compare more than two populations. Formally, we can think about it as a relationship between a dependent variable and an independent variable. So think about the dependent variable as the variable you care most about. And we want to know what affects it. So we think about the parking survey, and we think about how long it takes to find a spot. So we know that the university offers a number of different parking options, right? You can park in the freshman lot, you can park in an upperclassman lot, and of course, you don't have to pay for this. You could just park somewhere around town and then somehow get to campus. So we're very much interested in how long it takes to find a parking spot, and we have different places that we can park, and these different groups could differ in terms of how long it actually takes to find a spot. So we're in this situation where we want to know about certain things in life, and to do that, it might involve comparing multiple populations, so maybe three or more. So similar to the two population situation, we have to ask ourselves, are the differences we observe in our sample, are they real, or are they just due to sampling variation? Now, before we talk about the statistical tests that allow us to do that, we need to talk a little bit about variation. So here we have three fictitious groups. We have a red group, an orange group, and a yellow group. So it could be that maybe we're interested in recidivism. So the amount of time it takes for a youth in the juvenile court to be involved with the justice system again. So maybe the red group constitutes some new gender-neutral form of court intervention, some new program to rehabilitate youth, to lower the recidivism rate. We might consider the orange group to be traditional court services, and we might consider the yellow group to be some kind of gender-inclusive program. So all three of these options are available to a juvenile court, and we might be interested in which one actually causes them to take much longer to be involved with the justice system again in the future. So looking at these three diagrams, we can consider this black line as maybe a number line. The far left end of the black number line represents 0 days. So a youth is released and they immediately reoffend. We could consider the far right end of the black number line as some larger number of days. So the far end could be something like 3 years. So we can look at these three diagrams, and we can see that when it comes to the red group, all of those little circles, we could say that all those circles represent participants of this group. And we can see that there's some variation within this group. So some of those red dots are further to the left, and some of those red dots are further to the right. Looking at the second diagram, we can see a similar pattern. So we can consider each one of those orange dots to be some participant in traditional court services. And again, we can see that some of those orange dots are further to the left, and some of those orange dots are further to the right. And then again, we see the same pattern when it comes to the yellow group. So again, the yellow dots include people who took longer to recidivate, as well as those who took less time to recidivate. So we can look at these three groups, and we can see that they're different, right? So the red group is much lower than the orange group, which is much lower than the yellow group. We can see that all those yellow dots are pretty nicely clustered around that blue bar, which could be the sample mean. And we can see that the orange dots are really well clustered around the blue bar, which could be its sample mean. And then so forth with the red group. All of those red dots are pretty close together, and they're all clustered around that blue bar, which could be their sample mean. What we could do is we could increase the variation among these three groups. So here we've taken the red group and we've increased the amount of variation among all the participants. And we've also done that for the orange group and the yellow group. Now, if we look at these collections of dots, we can see that they don't look so different anymore, right? So there's a lot of overlap between the orange dots and the red dots. So in the context of court services, we might get the impression that traditional court services aren't really any better or worse than that new gender-inclusive program. Now, this is a really crucial factor because if we just compare these groups based off of sample means, then we would see that there were differences. So if we look at the first slide that we saw, these groups look different, and we have these blue sample means. And then with the second slide, we have the same sample means, but if the variation is really large, then it can be really hard to tell them apart. So variation makes it hard to identify group differences, even when the means are clearly different. Another way to think about this is that it's in fact variation that lets us really know when groups differ. If there's a small amount of variation and not a lot of overlap, then the groups are different. If there is a lot of variation and a lot of overlap, then the groups are basically the same. So we're going to focus on variation. This is going to be the core factor that allows us to compare whether or not there are differences among three or more groups. So two words that we sling around a lot are within group variation and between group variation. So within group variation is the variation among participants within groups. The between group variation is the variation between the groups themselves. So you can think of this as the variation, say, between group means. So here's a diagram. We have our three different groups. We could technically take our data set and divide it into three different groups. And then for each group, we could calculate a sample standard deviation. So for each group, we can figure out the within group variation. So within group variation, when we talk about that, what we're talking about is the variation among participants within their groups. When we talk about between group variation, what we're talking about is how much variation there is between each of the groups. So here you can think of each group as maybe being its own analytical unit. And each of these groups has some sample mean value. So we can have three sample mean values for these three groups, and we can take those values and we can calculate another standard deviation. So we can calculate some statistic to measure how much variation there is between these three groups. So when we talk about between group variation, we're talking about variation between groups, or in other words, variation between group means. So we can use what we know about these types of variation to test if differences exist among groups. So groups are going to be different if the between group variability is larger than the within group variability. So if the groups are very similar within each other, and there's not a lot of overlap, then the groups are different. So formally, we can calculate the within group variation and the between group variation using these two formulas. And what we can do is we can compare these two forms of variation. So if we create a ratio, for instance, so if we take the between group variation, or if we divide it by the within group variation, we get a ratio. And if that ratio is very large, then what this tells us is that the between group variation is very large compared to the within group variation. Or in other words, the groups are different. If, however, this ratio is really small, what this tells us is that there's not much advantage in the between group variation over the within group variation. So this tells us that the groups are basically the same.